all the great height of him and the wide waistband straining as ever. The veritable hero returns. How are you, Papa? I've missed you. Hope you got all my letters. And I hope you got all mine. I got many, and I suppose it was all of them, and you were very kind to think of writing to me. My God, Willie, he said, it was my honour to write to you. Willie, said Dolly, what are you after bringing me? He hasn't had a chance to do anything, I'm sure, said his father. Leave the lad be. We'll go down to Duffy's after Dolly and see what big gobstoppers she has for us, said Willie, a little abash. You will, of course, said his father. Then he cleared out the bigger girls, and Willie stripped out of his uniform and his long johns, and his father bagged them up and opened the rear door and flung them out to Maud and Annie for ginger boiling. Dolly sat in an old chair. It was a finely carved one, but very spindly, that had been their mother's special chair in the bedroom of old, a dress chair. Dolly watched the show gleefully, swinging her legs like a clock gone mad. Can we not come in? Annie teased, and her father roared back at her like she was a rascally hen advancing into the house against the wishes of the yard woman. So James Patrick, a man of 6'6", stood his son William, a man of 5'6", into the steaming zinc bath, as indeed Willie's mother had done 1,000 times while Willie was a boy. And it was a strange enough thing to see the policeman throwing on the accustomed moleskin apron, kept for the purpose, no doubt, of washing Dolly still, and fetching in close the basin with the big sponge and the carbolic soap. And he lathered the sponge up mightily, and he started to lave his son from head to foot, cascading the water neatly over everything. And the lice must have been flying from Willie Dunn, just like those poor men in Sackville Street from the Battens, and soon the water was speckled with them, little writhing white creatures. He saw under the suds or through them that his skin was all blotched with red circles, so he supposed he had the ringworm into the bargain. Certainly the nits must be in his head, because it was terrible itchy now in the steaming heat. But his hair was only recently cut as short as the Viceroy's lawn, so the nits had not much chance against his father's knit comb, which he wielded now like a delicate surgeon, combing out the ends. Then he asked his son politely to step out, and he fetched the big sheet from the range in the scullery, and came back in and wound it round and round his son, till he sucked the wetness off him. Then a pair of clean long johns of his father's was fetched, and the legs had to be rolled up in the arms, and then Willie put on his old working suit, from when he used to go out building. His uniform would be a while drying, what with the heavyish material in it. Then, when he was all ship-shape, his father put his big arms around him and held him close to him for a few moments, like an actor on the stage. It was not a thing you would see in real life anyway, and there was a faraway look on his father's face like it was all years ago and otherwise, and maybe they were still in Dalkey and he was a little lad. But he was a soldier now of some 19 years, and for all that, he was glad of his father's arms around him, strange as it was, strange and comforting as it was. Come on and get your hat on, Willie, and we'll go, shouted Dolly Dunn. So this little bit then, is our last bit. Your questions will be almost fully formed in your mind. And this is just them again, Christy and Willie and O'Hara. Do nothing really, entertaining themselves. And even at the war, obviously, especially at the war, that was a very important thing to do. It was a very hard war, and a very murderous, dirty war. But one of the strangenesses of the First World War is the incredible friendship that grew up between the soldiers. Most of whom, nearly all of whom, especially after 1914, were all volunteers, which is the reason that the officers had them walking slowly. You know, when you see it in the very few reels there are, and with machine guns, and they get killed almost immediately. And that was because they didn't believe that that volunteer men, non-soldiers, would be able for anything else. So they just said, hold your rifle and walk slowly forward and don't stop for anything. So that's really that's what they were told to do. But I mean, especially the Irish soldiers that from various parts of the world, but also North and South of Ireland, of course. You know, 200,000 altogether and 50,000 killed. And you have to wonder how
anyone, never mind the politics, why anyone would dream of enlisting for such a thing. And part of the reason was, of course, an intense feeling, because you have to put your mind back before 1916, before anything like that. For ordinary Dublin people, you put your mind back to it, and you know, the sense that Willie would have of his sisters being in peril when the Germans came through Belgium, and there's horror stories filtered back of them raping and murdering. And so, you know, there were many reasons for joining up. Also, of course, John Redmond saying that we were almost a country, and that the Irish volunteers could fight in the war as a mark of their new status in the world, and that it would hasten the approach of freedom in Ireland. And of course, it was the National Volunteers who broke away from that, and then they staged their 1916 rising. But this is just them, as I say, one of the reasons they were able to do it was because, I mean, this isn't asexual, they fell in love with each other, they were so close to each other, they lived in such a perdition and such a terminal world that it elicited that thing that is in ourselves as a creature. Sometimes when people are in a state of emergency, the most wonderful things are called forth from people around that person. And this is what I think caused this sort of friendship. Anyway, Christy Moran Willie has a bit of a reputation as a singer, and Christy wants him to sing a song that Christy thinks is called Half of Mary. She must have heard Willie sing before. And yes, your tragedy deepens because I have to sing a bit of Rose of Piccadilly. Anyway, we'll survive, hopefully. With the help of God and a few music. So this is later in the war. This is very deep in the war for Willie. This is kind of just before his point of no return, before he's kind of cast off by his father and his girlfriend. So it's a kind of moment of ease, really, in the book. Sing the Half of Mary, why don't you, said Christy Moran. That's kind of a religious song, said Willie Dunn. The Half of Mary. He would not dream of correcting the Sergeant Major. And it's in Latin. They were having a bit of a party. It was called a concert, but there were no real entertainers. They'd been given the little shed where these things took place, so they had a platform and 4 dozen chairs. Men who could find no place to sit were standing happily at the back, and most of them had found at least a bottle of beer. Then a man got up with that sudden air and manner that seemed to characterize an Irishman's idea of a singing party. Everyone hushed immediately. No one needed to be urged to silence. The man threw his head at an angle and put his hand to his face. It was very strange. Perhaps he was the sort of man who would usually have preferred to sing behind the door and not be seen by the company. Some of the best singers were behind the door singers, Willie in life had observed. The soldier struck his first note and passionately gave a ballad from the days of the Crimea. It was very lonesome, tender and bloody. There was a young girl in it, and a soldier, and a death. The listeners were stilled, because in the song there was a melody that brought from their own memories coloured hints and living sparks of the past. The past was a valued thing, but it was also dangerous to them in the toxic wastelands of the war. It needed a box of safety around it, and this small room for concerts was as good as they had found. Each man to his own inward thinking, glimpses of the beloved faces left behind, shadows of arguments unfinished and regretted, the sense of youth not vanishing but being submerged in a killing sea from which no one might emerge, bathed in the acid blood of bomb or bullet. Stretch of road loved and itemized, fold of field, love turn of shoulder in a wife, her feet crossing the boards of a bedroom, her clothes thrown across a chair. The voice of a singing child, the sound of a child peeing in the pot, the tremendous affection of son or daughter, soft hair, big eyes, the struggle to find meat and cake. For single men, the memories of their dresses, foul words and good words, failed words of love and triumphant, how human nature fell ever short, but could be summoned to illumine the dark tracks of a life nonetheless. All the matter and difficulty of being alive in a place of peace and a place of war. The man finished the song, and there was another kind of silence, the silence of men whose heads were seeing old pictures, and their minds were thinking old thoughts. And then there was tremendous applause. It was the silence before the applause that had pleased the singer most. "That is a beautiful song," said Christy Moran. "Fair play to you, Private."
Christy Moran himself longed to sing The Minstrel Boy, but he was gripped by a kind of horror and unseating fear. He had sung that song for his wife many times, and she'd been kind enough not to complain of his croaky tones and that oftentimes he'd forgotten the words and stumbled. He wanted to sing it because he suddenly desired greatly to converse with his companions, to communicate to these men under his command his gratitude to them and his love. It was not a thought that had come to him before. He wanted them to stand in place of his listening